quite a few things, I think, last week. It was kind of a little bit of a mishmash. I think it's not my favorite class because it kind of jumps all over the place. Today it's going to be a little bit more succinct, a little bit more chronological. We learned a lot of things. We talked about halakha. You remember the way of walking from halah, which means to walk. We talked about shema, which comes from the root shama, which means to hear with the intent to do. Kind of the physical aspect of the faith. Hebrew is a very dynamic faith, very much action-oriented, filled with all sorts of verbs. We talked about the Abrahamic covenant, the differences between the suzerain vassal covenant, which was the Abrahamic covenant, or at least the second part of it. We talked about the covenant made with Noah, which was a royal grant covenant, an unconditional covenant, which God swore never again to flood the earth, and all sorts of different topics that we covered last week. And to continue that today, we're going to be talking, this is really part one of two classes. This one really has to do with kind of bridging the gap. We've come a long way, in 2011 compared to how the peoples of the nations were perceived in the ancient scriptures. Okay? There's a whole history, an entire gap now that needs to be bridged. And things weren't always as they are now. During in this last class, we talked pretty much really in detail about the covenants, what was required, what is required of non-Jews. And that was finished up with Noah, really, because we didn't see any more added to that as far as observance to Abraham. And I told you we were going to talk about the Noahide laws, because the Noahide laws are really a rabbinic continuum of the rulings or the halakha that was given to Noah in Genesis chapter 9. So again, halakha that was established by God for Noah and his descendants. You remember 4 things he was told in Genesis chapter 9. Pru uvu, be fruitful and multiply. Meat was added to the list of things to eat. Before, remember Adam and Eve were instructed to eat only things that were from seed-bearing plants. Eat no flesh with blood. And Noah was also told, do not murder. So off of this, the rabbis developed what is called the Noahide laws, which are found in the Talmud. Now, all I'm going to say about the Talmud for right now is that it's a Jewish compendium of rabbinic interpretation. In another class, we're going to be getting much deeper into the traditions of the forefathers and those types of things. And there is an entire aspect of Talmud that we'll be discussing later. Right now, let's keep it at that. It's a Jewish compendium of rabbinic interpretation. The Noahide laws were essentially a beefed up halakha for Noah. So they said, you know what? What does it take for the peoples of the nations to live righteously? And so this is what was established around the end of the 2nd century. No blasphemy, no idolatry, no sexual immorality, no murder, no robbery, no eating blood and strangled animals. Even in Acts chapter 15, which we'll be talking about next time, which is really the second part of this class, you notice some of those? The not eating the blood and the strangled animals. Many of these really are built off of the original 4 commandments given to Noah. And of course, the one positive. The difference between positive commandments and negative commandments, obviously negative or thou shalt not, positive, thou shalt. And they were to set up courts known as a Beit Din, which was a house of worship. And really that Beit Din was in order to ensure the observance of those 6. Good. Right now? Not right now. Sorry, Jerry. If I was to do that, this would be like a 3-hour class, unfortunately. But we can do that probably by email if you'd like. The rabbis see these 7 as adequate for non-Jewish observance, and that even is for today, unless you choose to become a proselyte. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But do the scriptures talk a little bit more about biblical living? Here's a few things that we know about rabbinic commentary. And again, we're going to get into a little more detail later. But suffice it to say, rabbinic commentary can be very useful for research in understanding Jewish culture and observance, and it is an interpretive tool. It is to be used as an interpretive tool. Okay? Very, very good reference material for Jewish studies, Jewish history, Jewish observance. And there is a lot that is good that can be said within the Talmud. However, there is also an aspect of the Talmud that can be dangerous, especially for us as believers. Its emphasis can often stray from Scripture and likewise can contradict our Messianic beliefs. It's important to remember that it is not gospel, and discernment is crucial. In the 15 years or so that I've been involved in the Messianic Jewish movement, I've seen a handful of people, some of whom were good friends of mine, that decided to convert to Orthodox Judaism because they felt as though there was not enough Jewishness that was emphasized within the Messianic Jewish movement. And every single time that happened, it was a direct result of getting overly immersed and overly involved with Talmudic studies, with the traditions of the rabbis, and the next step, of course, being delving into the mystical aspect, which is the Kabbalah of that. Okay? I don't encourage anyone to dabble in Kabbalah. Although there are some interesting things in it, there are way too many landmines, way too much danger to be getting involved, especially when you look at the mystical foundations of it. There's a lot of witchcraft, medieval times, a lot of mysticism, and you know not the Talmud, but the Kabbalah is really elevated to this status that only certain people, even in the ultra-Orthodox community, are even allowed to study. So be very careful when you're studying these things. It is not the scriptures, it is the rabbinic commentary, in essence, on the scriptures. So I want to go to Ephesians chapter 2. We're going to start talking about the connection of the peoples of the nations. You'll hear me say non-Jews versus Gentiles. I prefer that term. You know, the word Gentiles has and can have a connotation to idolatry within the scriptures. It's not always, depending on the context. I've always used the word non-Jews, so just understand that that's what I'm saying. So let's read Ephesians 2, 11 through 13 and verse 19. Therefore, remember your former state, and this is again Rabbi Paul talking, you Gentiles by birth, called the uncircumcised by those who, merely because of an operation on their flesh, are called circumcised. At that time had no Messiah. You were estranged from the national life of Israel. You were foreigners to the covenants embodying God's promise. You were in this world without hope and without God. But now, you who were once far off have been brought near through the shedding of the Messiah's blood. That's a very comforting section of Scripture, I would say, to all those who are not of Jewish descent, without a doubt. Verse 19, so then, you are no longer foreigners and strangers. On the contrary, you are fellow citizens with God's people and members of God's family. So we start to see kind of the formation of the one new man concept that Shaul talks about later. This word that I've got an asterisk on here is foreigners, xenos in the Greek, and it literally means guests. And its implication is of those who are guests at a party. So what Shaul seems to be saying is that those of you who were, past tense, who used to be estranged from the national life of Israel, who used to be just guests, are now going to live in the same house as the owner. Think about the concept of guests. What usually takes place when you invite someone to your home as a guest and the party comes to an end? The party breaks up, you say your goodbyes, the owner of the home stays in the home, the guests go back to their place, correct? Shaul is breaking apart this whole concept. And in the realm of the spirit, and now descending into the physical, he is saying that you are no longer guests to leave the party when the party is over. Okay? No longer are you touching and dabbling and peeking from behind curtains you are now part of the household. Okay? You are not Israel. Okay? You are not Jews. But you are sitting at the same table, eating of the same foods, just in different seats. But we're all at the same table. We're all serving the same master. Now, through the blood of the Messiah, we're all living in the same house. You're no longer estranged from the national life. You're no longer estranged to the covenants. You are now people who are living in the same house. Long before we get to the time of Rabbi Paul's writings, we see the first example of a stranger. Can anyone guess where? Who was the first stranger? Of all people, we talked about Abraham last week a little bit. Genesis 23:4. The first time we see this word here. Abraham states, I am a stranger and a sojourner among you. Give me a burial site among you so that I may bury my dead out of my sight. What was the context here? You remember his wife, Sarah, at the age of 127. She passed away. Abraham mourns for her and then rises to ask a favor from the sons of Het. You remember the sons of Het? They were not the descendants, the ancestors. No, they are the descendants of the Hittites. Okay, the sons of Het. The Hebrew for stranger here is the word ger. Now you need to hang on to that word. It's a very important word. And it literally means an alien, a temporary inhabitant, or a stranger living outside of their country. And it comes from the word gur, which means to sojourn, to dwell in or with, and to abide. Even in the modern Hebrew, gar is the adequate word for to live. So all these are all of the same family. The most important thing to realize here is that this individual, this ger, lacked the inherited rights of one who was native born. Okay? That's why Abraham had to ask permission. He even declares himself to be estranged. Okay? Oh, I had that at the bottom there. Genesis 28:4. So I want to look at a few of these texts which contain this same word. Ger, coming from gur, and the concepts that really encompass this term